You all did them wrong, by the way. It's okay. You all did them wrong. All right, welcome back. All right, welcome back. Please sign in for the attendance. I'm not going to remind you every day. Just you have to know it's up there just to sign in. But 12 people are out now. If your name's on this list, that means you didn't sign in. Okay. Any questions? Anything on your mind? Anything bothering you? No? How do you really feel? One funny, sad, nice story. So one of my students from my class last year came to me today, and her house was flooded by Harvey. And I don't know why, but when she had to evacuate her house, what was one of the few things she packed? I don't know why. I couldn't tell her, but she brought it to me today. She showed it to me. It was all faded and all beat up, but still over notes in it. So these are apparently important documents, and if you're ever in need of evacuation, in case of emergency, bring the Constitution. Did you lose yours? No.
I did have one question that
Yeah, what's your question?
Pro tanto.
I'm sorry?
Pro tanto.
Where'd you see that?
That was in Prigg.
It means like to the extent of.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello. See, if you were on time, you know what that is.
That's cool.
You know, I'll tell you, last year I had a policy that if you were not in your seat when the class started, I mark you absent. I'm not doing that this year for reasons actually beyond my control. The reason why is iClicker has a feature which lets me do the polling, right? It used to be that I would take attendance, stop the attendance exactly at 7:30, and then run the poll. But with their new software, if I stop the attendance, I can't do the poll anymore. So now I actually have to leave the attendance up to the poll. So I had to modify my attendance policy, but please try to be here right on time. What that is to explain is one of my students last year, her house was flooded by Harvey. And when she had to evacuate her house, she brought a pocket Constitution with her and actually survived the storm. There you go. Pro tanto means the extent of, or to the certain extent. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a request.
Yes.
We can't really hear back here when the ConLaw asks questions about it.
You could also move forward.
What I could do, hear with me. I'm excited to the Constitution.
I'll try to repeat when people up front say something, but this is directed to your classmates.
Yes.
Am I loud enough? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. That's what's important. All right, and I'll try to repeat everything that they say. All right. Anything else in your minds? Okay. Let's start with a question, a polling question. So now I go start poll. Okay. iCloud's running. Okay. Yeah, they changed the way this runs. I don't like how it is, but I'm stuck with it because it's otherwise good. Okay. So here's your question. Multiple choice. Okay. Question is this. Which enumerated power or powers in Article 1, Section 8 did Chief Justice Marshall rely on in McCulloch v. Maryland to uphold the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States? A, the Commerce Clause. B, the taxing power. Nothing into the taxing clause. No such clause. But the taxing power. C, the necessary and proper clause. Or D, all of the above. And take about another 30 seconds and try to take a stab at that question. Do you see it? Does some of you see at least? Okay. Sorry. All right. Let's wrap up here. Okay. Where did I fall off last time? Who was the last one to go? Okay. Monique, are you next? No, she's not here. Okay, so who's next? So are you next? Okay, I'll call on you then. Did I do this row? No? Okay. Okay, Dusty, I'll call on you. What did you put here?
C, the necessary and proper clause.
Okay, why'd you put C?
Because the Commerce Clause and the taxing There's not anything in the Constitution that specifies the creation of or the institution of a bank. So the necessary and proper clause gives the power to create a bank as a necessity to or a convenience to the commerce clause.
But doesn't a bank regulate commerce? Doesn't a bank
It helps to regulate.
impose taxes and collect taxes?
It helps those things, yes.
Gerald, so let's take a look at the necessary and proper clause, okay? We have the text here. It says, oh, do I have it? Here we go. It says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying to execution the foregoing powers. So, Gerald, when it says foregoing powers, what is it referring to? See, I have to talk louder. Kanisha can't hear that. See? Yeah, I'm trying. What does foregoing powers refer to?
Powers that arise out of the Constitution.
What powers are those?
All powers that are essentially enumerated
Enumerated where?
in Article 1, Section 8.
Ah, there you go, right? So we take our Constitution, right? The necessary and proper clause is the very last one listed in Article 1, Section 8. Was it clause 16 or 17? I always forget the number, right? When it says foregoing, that means stuff before it. Clauses 1 through 16, right? So when it says foregoing powers, it refers back to the Commerce Clause, coining money, post office facility, other good stuff. It's almost always commerce, right? So let me go back to our poll question, right? As a Dana. So Dusty said a minute ago that making a bank is helpful to regulate commerce. We say that chartering a bank is necessary and proper way to regulate commerce. So is it only the necessary and proper clause, or is it also the Commerce Clause? Just take a look how I phrased the question. Is it only the Commerce Clause?
I would say yes.
Why?
Because
I'm sorry, necessary and proper clause. Only necessary and proper. You know what I meant. Is it only necessary and proper?
yes,
Why?
because one thing that Siri said that it's because I'm not gonna phrase this. They do it that way because it's helpful to have I think it's a bank or it's but I don't know.
You want to try, Marcus? You want to take a step? Why is it only necessary and proper? That's what Dusty said. Why is she right, or is she not right?
Because the issue, as far as I remember, wasn't whether or not the federal government could regulate what the bank is doing, but whether or not Congress had the power to, or the necessary means to act on that power to tax.
Well, Marcus, let me ask the question a little bit differently. Is a necessary and proper clause an independent source of authority, or does it only work because it's linking up to another source of authority?
It works with looking up to another source.
Okay, so then why is the answer here C? Why is it not all the above? Ooh,
That's a good question.
that's a good question. Kristen, what do you think?
I said all of the above,
You said all the above. Tell me why you think all the above.
because McCullough versus Maryland was like an expansion of the powers given to Congress, and so I feel like it kind of expanded the Commerce Clause and their taxing power.
Ah, so you're saying that necessary and proper is not independent, but it expands the other one.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, Sergio, what do you think? Dusty says it's only C, and then Kristen says it's all the above.
Yeah, but if the question is, what was the reason for having a bank, it would be the necessary and proper clause.
Only.
Only.
Dusty, you want to make an addendum?
Well, what I was going to say is that if you took the Commerce Clause independent from the necessary and proper clause, that doesn't give Congress the power to charter a bank. It doesn't specify chartering a bank as one of its powers.
All right, let's take a look at the results. Let's just see who we got here. Wow. Okay, so almost 90%, 85% of you put necessary and proper clause, and about 15% of you put all the above. The answer is C, right? But let me explain why. And I think, Kristen, you're not wrong. I think, Marcus, you're actually not wrong. I just think C is the better answer. Let me explain why. The necessary and proper clause is an independent enumerated power. It can stand on its own 2 feet so long as it links back to a foregoing power, right? This is a question for Marcus and Kristen. It is independent as long as it links back to an enumerated power like commerce or coining money or taxing. Now there are limits, right? It's not proper if it's too much. And we don't know what exactly that means, right? Necessary refers to whether it's helpful or convenient, the word Marshall used. But if it goes too far, if it's too big of a power, then it's no longer proper. So the restraint is baked right into it. We have to understand necessary and proper as an independent source of authority. Let me tell you something. Most law students do not understand that point. Most judges don't understand it. It's such a common mistake. And I can prove it to you. In several of the cases you read today, they only talk about commerce, and they don't mention necessary and proper. And that's a mistake. It's lazy. Judges make it all the time. They don't understand the distinction. You always have to look at both commerce and necessary and proper as separate elements. You can't merge them all together. They're linked. It's a foregoing power, but they have separate bases. Does everyone understand that point? And very often, you'll see a case where the court is basically talking about necessary and proper, but doesn't use those words. And that's what drives law students nuts. They'll say, well, it's a convenient means to an end, or if the ends are legitimate. These sorts of words, they're talking about necessary and proper. Judges don't get this consistently right. It complicates things, but you will. Make sense? Okay. Oh yeah, Clay.
First thing, when you begun there, you said necessary and proper clause is an independent source of authority. You said if it links, though, right?
As long as it links back to a foregoing power, right? So long as it's necessary to execute commerce, for example, it provides an independent source. It doesn't expand. And Chris, you're not wrong. I think you have the right idea. It's not that necessary and proper clause expands commerce. It's that it is itself an expansion. That you can go beyond regulating commerce to other stuff. And the first case, Prigg, I think will illustrate this point very well. It's a case that, have you ever heard of Prigg versus Pennsylvania before? No hands. Everyone knows Dred Scott, right? Everyone's heard of Dred Scott. Let me tell you something. In terms of an impact on slavery, Prigg was like 1,000 times worse. Like, I can't even exaggerate. Dred Scott was a fairly narrow question about diversity citizenship. We'll get there later, right? And by the time you have Dred Scott, we're like 4 years in the Civil War. It's basically beyond the point of no return. This case was 1842, I think. It might be off by a year or two. 1842. This case basically put us on the road towards secession. And let me explain to you why. When the Constitution was first ratified, there was a very uneasy compromise made about slavery. And there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's the northern states recognized that they didn't do certain things for slavery, that they wouldn't have a union. And one of the provisions to get this sort of compromise, and compromise is the wrong word, but this balance, was the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Fugitive Slave Clause. It's in Article 4, Section 2, and I'll read it to you. It says, no person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. There's a lot going on. Let me take it one clause at a time, right? So first off, no person held to service or labor in one state. It means slave, right? Just be honest. They didn't want to use the word slave, but that refers to slaves. So a person who's a slave in one state, let's say Maryland, to make it easier. If you're a slave in Maryland, under the laws of Maryland, and you escape into another state, let's just call it Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania was a free state, Maryland was not. Shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, that says, so if you escape from Maryland to Pennsylvania, it doesn't matter what the law is in Pennsylvania, right? You're not getting discharged from service. That means emancipated, free. I say it again. Slave runs from Maryland to Pennsylvania. Doesn't matter what Pennsylvania law says. Pennsylvania cannot emancipate that runaway slave. Okay? Instead, that slave shall be delivered on the claim of the party to whom such service is due. What does that mean? The owner of the slave can come back and claim it, right? Claim that person, bring it back down to Maryland. Understand? Everyone just get the mechanics. So let's look what this clause does and doesn't do. Without a doubt, this law says that states cannot emancipate a runaway slave. That much is easy, right? That sort of law would be unconstitutional. It also says that a state must facilitate the return of a runaway slave. That much I think we can all agree on. But does this provision, this fugitive slave clause, give Congress an enumerated power? I say again, does this clause give Congress an enumerated power? Clay, what do you think? Does this give Congress power over runaway slaves?
I would say yes.
Okay, why do you say that?
Because it supersedes the state law and allows them to supersede the state law.
Oh, the Constitution supersedes state law, no question about that. My question to you is a little more narrow. Does this provision, Article 4, Section 2, give Congress an enumerated power? That's the question.
Oh, yes, I mean, an enumerated power is named in the Constitution.
What powers does it give Congress?
Sorry?
What power does this clause give to Congress? What does it give Congress the power to do?
To allow the recovery of slaves.
Where does it say that?
Shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom the
But where does it say Congress has a power? That's my question to you.
Nowhere.
Marcus?
It just resolves an issue between the states.
Oh, say it again, everyone, so we can hear you.
It just resolves an issue between the states only.
I think he's right. And this is the argument that Salmon Chase, who was the future Chief Justice, advanced, right? If you look at the text carefully, I read it through very slowly, deliberately, right? This doesn't look like enumerated power. So, I mean, look, Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the power to do this, right? Congress has the power to do that. Congress can regulate commerce. Congress can impose taxes. Congress can, coin money, whatever. Congress this, Congress this, Congress this. All the powers listed in Article 1. Then we get to Article 4. And remember I said Article 4 is like a hodgepodge? Article 4 generally refers to the relationships between the states. Marcus said it correctly. I think, and this is, I'm reading this 200 years later, I think the best reading of this clause is it doesn't actually give Congress any powers. And just juxtapose it. Go to the very next section, right? Article 4, Section 3. Right? The very next page. It says, the Congress shall have the power to dispose of property and make rules and regulations. That gives Congress a power. Right? So Article 4, Section 3 gives Congress power over certain property in the federal territories. But Article 4, Section 2, I think Marcus said this correctly, there's no power given. Everyone with me so far? This was a very, we have constitutional debates today. You had constitutional debates 200 years ago, right? This is a very fiery constitutional debate in the early republic. So then the question becomes this, Janice, what enumerated power gave Congress the authority to enact the Fugitive Slave Act? Now again, you have a Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, the clause, and the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a piece of legislation. Don't get them confused. Get Fugitive Slave Clause, Article 4, and Fugitive Slave Act, which was a piece of legislation. So Janice, what power gave Congress the authority to enact the Fugitive Slave Act? Which enumerated power?
The necessary.
That's right. That's correct. Does Article 4 standing by itself give Congress that power?
No. Combined with it, it gives you.
But now we ask you a follow-up question, right? We go back to our necessary and proper clause. And it says, Congress has the power to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying to execution the foregoing powers. Did we just say there's no power in Article 4?
Right.
So is that a foregoing power?
No. The Article 4 itself, the clause is not a foregoing power, but the act was the legislation included.
No. But the necessary and proper clause says they can carry into execution the foregoing powers in the Constitution.
Mhm.
You following me?
Mhm.
So what is is Article 4, Section 2 a foregoing power? Did we just say what Marcus said?
You just said it wasn't.
Aha! So this is the argument of Justice Chase, or he wasn't Justice yet, but he became Justice a couple years later. Everyone following here, right? Foregoing power refers back to Article 1, Section 8, the first 16 clauses. Is Article 4 in that list? No. So it's Justice Chase argued, he wasn't, I keep saying Justice, but Salmon Chase argued was, Congress has no power to enforce the slave clause. None. You can't do it on its own face, and the necessary and proper clause will not get you there, because it's not a foregoing power. The ultimate argument, I think, is actually pretty savvy. Foregoing means the stuff came before it. That's in Article 1, Section 8. This is in Article 4, it comes after. So it's not a foregoing power, it's an aftergoing power. I don't know what the right word is, right? But it comes afterwards. But, you know, the abolitionists, I want to just understand this, right? The abolitionists weren't just making political arguments. They made very sophisticated legal arguments based on the text of the Constitution. If you go to Lysander Spooner and Frederick Douglass, they were making constitutional arguments at a very high level. And this is one of them. And I think as a textual matter, Chase is correct. I've been teaching this case for years. And every I teach, I was like, yeah, he's right. It makes more sense. But then why did Justice Story not go along with Chase? That's what I want you guys to understand, right? This textual argument, we can all agree, makes good sense. But the court upheld the Slave Act. They upheld one, and then there was another one that came some years later. It was much more stringent. Charlie, you raise your hand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't you just, or at least why wasn't the argument made that it could just be a loop? Because
What do you mean a loop?
So that's what I'm about to explain. So the
Yeah.
next part says all other powers vested in this Constitution.
Powers.
So why wouldn't you be able to just continuously make that loop argument that would say Article 4 is powered by the necessary and proper clause, and then that powers Article 4, and then just keep, because it's all other powers.
My head hurts.
I know, but that's what I was thinking. Why
Well, but
wouldn't-
still, it goes back to Marcus's question, is there any power in Article 4, Section 2?
Not standing alone, but that's why I keep thinking of it more as a loop.
But if it's a loop, right, that means that the necessary and proper clause stands by itself, independent of any power, right? You gotta link it back. Again, necessary and proper can be an independent power, but it's gotta link to some power, right? It's gotta link back to something.
So all other doesn't really mean everything.
Well, all other can simply mean stuff in Article maybe 4 or 5, right? There's no problem. For example, the property clause I mentioned a minute ago, that's a power, and necessary and proper can link up to that. But I like what you're thinking, but you made a head hurt for a minute. Yeah, it'd be an infinite loop, right? We keep going circle, circle, circle. That can't be the right answer. Because we have a government of enumerated powers. It can't be unlimited.
Right.
But let's just stick on this for a minute. Mia.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the text of Article 4 doesn't actually convey a power to do anything.
Right.
So then how does Justice Story, again, Justice Story was like by the way, everyone knows Roger Taney is like this evil guy, right? Who ever heard of Justice Story? No one. It fascinates me that the Dred Scott decision is just this one case everyone knows, but other decisions that are much worse just skid under the radar. For example, who authored Plessy v. Ferguson? Which justice? Anyone know the name? Justice Brown? No one even knows the name. Just Dred Scott just has this stain that the other cases that are far worse just don't. I'll never get it for the life of me, but here we are. Mia, how does Justice Story go about holding then that the Slave Act is within Congress's powers? Walk me through that, please.
He says that Congress has exercised powers that are necessary and proper as a means to carry into effect rights that are expressly given and duties expressly enjoined.
Okay.
So this is a right that is given
Mm-hmm.
in there. Article 4, Section 2.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, they have the power to enforce that right through the necessary and proper
So
law.
does Story agree that this Article 4 is only a relation between the states? Does he think it goes as more than that?
No.
Yeah.
He believes that Congress is empowered to enforce that.
Okay, now why? That's the key question. Why does Story believe that Congress should enforce this, what's effectively a issue between two states?
Well, he gives like 4 kind of main reasons.
Okay.
He looks at it historically,
that it was a fundamental article.
Yeah.
And without the adoption of which the Union couldn't have been formed. That the purpose of the clause was to secure to the slaveholding states the complete right and title of ownership. That if the Constitution hadn't contained this clause, every non-slaveholding state in the Union, like the perpetual strife between states, and the best meaning would be to avoid an interpretation that fails to secure a manifest purpose.
Okay.
And he started back with what the purpose was previously.
Very good, thank you. So Mia said a lot of things that are very correct. I want to get them one at a time. When you approach constitutional law, there are different ways of approaching it, right? What I've been giving you, what Justice Chase gave you, is what we might call textualism, right? You look at the text of the Constitution and you follow it. And I think here the text gives a pretty straightforward answer. It doesn't always do it, but I think here it does. But Justice Story doesn't limit himself to the text. He looks at what can be called purpose, right, or the intent. What is the purpose of the Constitution? And you see here how the text goes in one direction and the purpose goes in a completely opposite direction. So what does Story say? He's like, look, if the Constitution didn't give Congress the power to regulate slavery, then we wouldn't have a republic in the first place, right? That the states wouldn't have joined the Union if Pennsylvania could just liberate every single slave that came through. I mean, this is the point of the Underground Railroad, actually, getting to Canada, right? The goal was because the northern states couldn't liberate or emancipate them. That's why they were going up north. But if you were able to have states with a union emancipate the slaves, slavery would end very quickly. So, as a historical matter, Story is probably correct that the people who voted on the Constitution probably had that understanding. But the words they chose didn't accomplish that. So how do we reconcile that, right? Where the text, I think, is solid, slam dunk for Justice Chase, slam dunk for Justice Chase, without a question. But the purpose, I think, is probably a slam dunk for Justice Story, right? And what do you do when the text goes one way and the purpose goes the exact opposite direction? To this day, the justices do not agree on that question, right? It's an ongoing, never-ending dispute. But I think here in Prigg, the purpose argument prevailed, and the majority opinion buys this over and over again. And you'll see this again in Dred Scott, where Dred Scott, Taney as well. It was understood that people of African descent could be citizens, we would have a republic. It's the exact same argument. You will see when you read Dred Scott, it's basically just a story on just a bigger scale. It's the same sort of purpose-based argument. Everyone with me so far? Everyone with me? Okay? So the court says, Article 4 gives Congress the power, and because it's a power, you can then hook in, link up, necessary and proper. And if you link in necessary and proper, it's expanded, right? It gives Congress the power to not only regulate this relationship between the states, but prohibit state laws to the contrary. Because under the Supremacy Clause, if Congress passes a law regulating a certain act, then the states can't get in the way. So Pennsylvania wants to create this process. But let's talk about this process for a minute. Actually, Jesse, you want to talk about this? We asked about this earlier. She came to the office. So what exactly did the Pennsylvania Liberty Law accomplish? What did it actually require?
For them to go get a certificate.
Who's that?
The person that is going to get the certificate.
Good. Very good. And what's the certificate process? Walk me through this.
You have to go to the judge and basically get
A
permission.
state judge or federal judge?
State judge.
Very good. Okay, so I understand that what Pennsylvania was actually very savvy. They said, look, okay, if we pass a law that says all slaves are emancipated, we're screwed. We can't do that because of the Slave Act. So let's try another thing. We said, okay, I'll tell you what. If you come to our state trying to capture a person and return them to Maryland, go to a judge and ask the judge for a certificate. And all you have to show is that, I'm here, I have my paperwork, I want to bring this person back to Maryland, etc. Isn't that just simply facilitating the federal law, or just helping it become, making it, and Jesse, what did we talk about there earlier?
The judge would probably say no to that.
Yeah, and that's what happened here, right? The judge turned away Prigg. He said, nope, not giving you a certificate, sorry. And that's why he had to kidnap Miss Morgan. He had to kidnap her. It wasn't
In fact, Prigg tried to comply with Pennsylvania law. The judge was like, nope, not going to do it. Now, why? Well, let's put it this way. Slave owners didn't always have the best paperwork. That's to put the most sugar-coated way you can. They couldn't satisfy to a judge's burden of proof that they were the owner. And moreover, the judge shall tell you what, let's get an attorney for this guy. Let's have a hearing. Let's have a trial. Let's have a jury maybe, right? Pennsylvania was very smart. They were trying to erect barriers, called an obstacle, call it whatever you want, right? But they were trying to make it, if not impossible, really hard to return a slave down to Maryland. So this was a not so subtle way of telling the feds, we don't like your damn law. We're not going to conflict with it, but we're going to make it as hard as possible to comply with your federal law. And in fact, Prigg, who didn't comply with the law, went to jail, right? They arrested the guy. They made it a crime to fail to comply with their own law. So we're going to understand the operation of how this worked. So Congress said, no, we can't have these states interfering with this slave catching situation. So they enact this law. As a consequence of enacting this law, all state laws to the contrary are not valid, right? Go to the Supremacy Clause in Article 6. I have it up here somewhere, right? The laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land, and anything in the laws of any state to the contrary are void. Because the Fugitive Slave Act was constitutional, the state law was void. Why? It was contrary. Key word there, contrary. So in other words, why did Story have to decide was the Slave Act constitutional? Because the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional, and Pennsylvania was fine. Say it again. If the federal Fugitive Slave Act was constitutional, Pennsylvania was fine. They didn't need anything, right? They could enact their law. But because the Fugitive Act was constitutional, Pennsylvania could not enact their law. And one other note, and the judges in every state will be bound thereby. What does that mean? The state judges were bound to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. The state judges couldn't require the certificate business, right? The state judges were required to comply with the Fugitive Slave Act. Everyone see that? That's right in the text. Right? Once you get past, is the Fugitive Slave Act constitutional, then this case gets a little bit easier, right? But the initial threshold probably wasn't right. One other point. Is that Noel?
Yes.
Noel, could Congress require the state police, for example, to enforce these slavery laws? Could Congress say, state police, if you find a runaway slave, you must bring them back to Maryland?
No, the federal government has to enforce that themselves.
Ah, why? How do we know that? How do we know that? You're right, you're absolutely right, but how do we know that?
I didn't catch the name of it, but I read it.
You read it. Anyone? Yeah?
It's in there. It's that the anti-commandeering that.
Commandeering. Someone watched the video. Very good. Yes.
You said it. That the states
Yeah.
cannot be compelled, and it
Yeah.
might well be unconstitutional. An unconstitutional exercise of power of interpretation to
Very
insist
good.
that states are bound.
So the state judges are bound, but not the state executive branch officials. So in other words, the Fugitive Slave Act says judges, you have to play along. You can't do the certificate business. But the state executive branch is not required to facilitate slave transfer. So it wasn't all victory for the federal government. The feds lost on one part. But they won on the important part, which is the judges. The judges had to administer this slave system. They couldn't impose additional criteria. Right? Everyone understand that much? So the Fugitive Slave Act was upheld by Justice Story in the opinion. As a result, it became, how do I put this? It became very difficult for the North and South to see peace at the end of this road. Right? This case made it clear there was going to be a conflict. In fact, there was a legitimate fear that with this sort of holding, that slavery could extend beyond the borders of a state, that the Supreme Court might actually hold that slavery was a right in all 50, however many states there were, it was a right coast to coast. Right? Because if a state couldn't eradicate slavery in its own borders, then why not? A slave owner could simply bring his slaves to another state, and that's where slavery exists. In fact, in the Dred Scott decision, that was what the case is about. Does bringing a slave to a free state liberate the person? That was the basis of the case. So, I mean, this case was about a decade, 12 years before Dred Scott, but you could see this was headed towards a direction that wasn't looking too good for the Union. Just as like an earlier step, which again was far more significant than Dred Scott. Okay, so let me just summarize if I can briefly. The Article 4 clause didn't actually give Congress the power to regulate the slave traffic, but the court said that was a power, and under the necessary and proper clause, Congress could regulate states that interfere with the return of slavery. Right? So again, this is a very big necessary and proper case, and I would say that this goes beyond McCulloch. I think the language Justice Story uses is even more loose than McCulloch. At least in McCulloch, is saying necessary to enforce the Commerce Clause, right? Okay, fine, we can agree or not. But here it's necessary to enforce, not a power. So I think Prigg has a broader reading of necessary and proper than did Justice Marshall in McCulloch v. Maryland. All right, so any questions on Prigg? Very important case. People don't really study it. They should more. Yes, is that Yareen?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you said that Article 4 didn't necessarily give him the power, but it was just read to give the power when linked with the necessary power.
That's how Story read it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, I think as a textual matter, he's wrong, but as a matter of purpose, he's on much stronger ground.
Okay.
So it depends how you approach constitutional law, and to give you an easy one, right? If you look at the text of the 14th Amendment, it speaks of, persons, doesn't say men or women. But if you look at purpose, well, they didn't intend men and women to have certain rights. So you have this conflict between the text being sometimes broader than the purpose. In other cases, purpose might be broader than text. You can pick and choose. It doesn't always work the same way. I'm going to kill myself with this thing. This classroom is a freaking death trap. Just the way these steps are, and like this. I mean, like I'm not that tall, but I think I just clear it, like by a couple seconds. No, actually, no. I think I'll walk right into it. Yeah, no. So if I concuss myself, you'll know why. All right. Any questions on Prigg? Anything else in your minds? Oh yeah, Mia, and then Kyle.
So where the act is constitutional, the states can't even add to the federal legislation.
They cannot interfere with it. So this comes up in a lot of situations. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Arizona, I won't teach this case, I'll mention it. Arizona had a law called SB 1070, the Show Your Papers law, for example. They said, look, we want people who gets pulled over, we'll check their immigration status. They said, we're trying to help the feds with immigration enforcement. And then the federal government said, no, you're interfering. Like, you're not helping us, you're hurting us. And the Supreme Court said, well, you can't impose obstacles, you can't meddle with federal policy. So this case still comes up to this day, right? Can the states go beyond what the federal government is doing? Kyle?
Yes, so you mentioned that the slave catchers and slaveholders don't always have good title, basically, or papers to document their title?
Maybe not to the satisfaction of a Pennsylvania judge, but
okay.
Yeah.
And so my question is, there were free people in Pennsylvania who were not subject to being captured by the slave catchers.
Yeah.
So why can Pennsylvania not argue that they're trying to protect those citizens from...
That was, you ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave?
No, you recommended it. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's not an easy movie to watch. It's not an easy movie to watch. But the premise is, there was a free black man in New York, right? I think he was in upstate New York. He was in Saratoga Springs, upstate New York. And a slave catcher tricked him and drugged him and brought him down south. There was a legitimate argument that this process was needed to ensure free black men were not dragged down south.
Yeah.
But the court didn't agree with that one. Again, this is why Prigg was so much worse than Dred Scott. I mean, this actually affected the lives of so many people in this time. Because, again, one point, the fugitive slave trade, that is, remember the triangle trade, that was eradicated in about 1810, give or take. It might be off on the year. Just checking on the year, but it was eradicated. So because you couldn't import more slaves, they required to steal them from north, bring them down south. That was the new business model. So this decision basically gave a green light to that practice. Again, people don't study Prigg, so I put it second or third class this semester. All right, anything else? right, let's move on. The next batch of cases are somewhat not consolidated, but they have a common theme in that they were decided within the span of like 2 or 3 years, all by the Chase court. So again, Salmon Chase, who I mentioned a moment ago, he became President Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, and then after Roger Taney died, Lincoln appointed Chase as the Chief Justice to replace Taney. Taney, as we discussed, had a much more narrow conception of federal power than did Marshall and then did Story. And this comes out in the first case, which is really short. I'm sure you love reading it. United States versus DeWitt. Okay, Quinn, I think you're next.
Yes.
You want to give me the facts, please, in DeWitt? Very easy. Facts aren't tough there.
Yeah. So there was a law enacted by Congress.
Good.
Prohibiting, like, restricting certain types of oil, like lamp oil or illuminating oil.
Uh-huh.
And DeWitt was indicted for selling it,
Uh-huh.
and DeWitt argued that because he was acting within the borders of the states, that Congress did not have control.
Very good. Thank you, Quinn. Right? So again, Congress passes a law to prohibit, it's a criminal offense, the sale of certain types of oil. Now, you're asking, why is Congress banning these oils? Well, they weren't very safe, right? Lighting these oils can make a fire. And so there might be a good reason why they had this, but that's not the question. If Michigan wanted to prohibit the sale of these oils, they can do it. There's not much of a question about that. But the question here is whether whether the federal government has the enumerated power to prohibit this. So, Vincent, what's probably the most important case that you've learned so far that bears on DeWitt? You've only done 5 or 6 cases, so you have a very small number to pick from.
Yeah.
A very small number to pick from.
I don't know if they mentioned them in this case.
They didn't.
They didn't mention in this case.
But just from your memory, we've done like 5 or 6 cases, right? What's the most important case?
It's
not Marbury.
It's not Marbury. That was the one we started with. That's the easiest one to remember.
You gotta know your cases, my friend. We do this all semester long, so you gotta know your cases.
Oh man, I don't. Gibbons?
What's Gibbons about?
Gibbons is the one. That was the boat case.
That was the boat case. Very good.
It was a commerce case. Yeah.
And how did John Marshall define commerce? What was that one word he used that made us all giggle?
He used the word intercourse.
Thank you. Intercourse, right? Exchange. That's what commerce means. Is selling oil within one state commerce?
No.
Why not?
Well, because commerce basically means between.
Well, how did John Marshall define?
It's more than one.
How did Marshall define commerce among? Here, let's take the Commerce Clause, right? He said Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. How did Marshall define among? What's that word he used?
Intermingled.
Ooh, very good. Intermingled. So Marshall says intercourse that's intermingled with the different states, right?
Correct.
Is this sale of oil in this case, I think it was in Detroit, is it intermingled between the different states?
I believe it was all within the limits of the
Very
state.
good. And one last question, you're done. What did Marshall say about commerce entirely within a single state?
That is the power reserved to the states.
Perfect. Everyone heard what we said? When it's commerce that's entirely within a single state, it's a power reserved to the state's police power. The state police power is prevailing. Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate the local sale of oil. It's not intermingled with, there's no intercourse, right? Nothing. It's solely local. Okay. So is it my or May?
Mine.
My. Is that the end of the story? Do we just say, okay, Congress can't do it under the Commerce Clause, that's the end of the story? Is that it? What else would you have to say?
I would love to say that was it, but
Because
that
you want to be done.
you wouldn't have to.
No, I wouldn't have that question done.
So, give me one moment to discord.
Objection leading, right? You know, all my questions are leading. It's all cross. This entire class is one cross exam. badgering the witness, you know, I can hold people in contempt if they come late. No, that's how it works. Yeah.
I think the facts of the case said something about he has to do with the border.
What did I say earlier in this class, right? You just stop at the Commerce Clause.
No, you try to analyze the necessary and proper clause as well.
Yes, ma'am. So, what's the argument the government raised of why prohibiting local oil sales is necessary and proper? Right? It's not commerce. What powers do they say it links up to? Okay.
To land collect taxes.
Yes, ma'am. Why?
I didn't think you would ask me another question.
No, this question's right. Okay, thank you for bailing her. Okay, no, Janice is correct. So what the government argues here is that they need to prohibit the sale of certain types of oils. Why? Because they tax other kinds of oils. You follow me? Right? They want to raise revenue. Say, look, we tax oils number 1, 2, and 3, so let's ban oil number 4, so people buy 1, 2, and 3 more. Everyone get that, right? It's almost like we want to make more money, so let's criminalize the stuff we can tax, so that people have to buy the stuff we can tax. Everyone get that? Tim, I think you're next.
Yes, sir.
And why is an argument rejected by the court? Why does Chief Justice Chase say, no way, that's not going to work?
Yeah, well, he looks at it and says that in the paragraph, it's the consequence is too remote and too uncertain.
What does that mean?
By that, it goes back to what Justice Marshall wrote, saying that it essentially is a pretext.
Pretext. What does that mean, pretext? That's very good.
Pretext, it's the fact that they're coming up with some arbitrary cover to excuse what they want to do.
And what are they really trying to do here, Tim?
In this particular case, they're trying to restrict the trade in order to raise taxes, which would be a legitimate exercise, but it's the fact of how they're going about it that it takes it beyond it being proper.
Very good. So we said a few things that are right. What Chief Justice Chase says is, this is not the real reason, right? You're not actually doing this to raise revenue or whatever. You're trying to ban a local transaction, and you can't ban local commerce. That's beyond your power, right? And because it's beyond your power, you can't loop it into necessary and proper, right? This is not actually an exercise of your taxing power. And really, I think what Chase is saying here, it's not a proper exercise of power, right? This might be helpful for your taxing power, but it's not really proper. He doesn't say that, though, which is why this case is so tough to read. It's in very few case books. He doesn't really mention McCulloch, right? Doesn't really mention necessary and proper. He kind of hints, he kind of tap dances around it. Now, why, Samantha? Why do you think he doesn't go off citing McCulloch and necessary and proper? What problems might that raise? And think about, where he is in the court this time and place. Why is he not going to, this is McCulloch we're using?
Necessary and proper expands powers, and that's not what this court wanted to do.
Oh, so what case would this be in conflict with? What case would Chase's opinion be in conflict with? We haven't done that many, so you can think across the elimination. What case we read gives a very broad application of the necessary and proper clause? Samantha. No. Keep going. Keep going. Keep flipping through notes. We only have three days of class so far. What case did you study that gives a very broad application of necessary and proper power? Prigg. Prigg was decided, what, about 20 years earlier? Yeah. So, Samantha, let me ask you a follow-up, please. Is Chief Justice Chase's application of necessary and proper consistent with Prigg? No, it's not. Look at how Story did his analysis of Prigg. He took Article 4, which doesn't even have a power, and said, yeah, sure, you you can add necessary and proper to Article 4 and read it really broadly, right? Here, the government has a taxing power. It's actually in there. They say, no, 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 that's too remote. In other words, if the argument in DeWitt is too remote, then in Prigg, without question, it's way out of bounds, right? So I think, and I don't know, Chase realized that he was basically ignoring Prigg. He was kind of ignoring McCulloch, but maybe you can squeeze in it, but he was, without question, acting in spite of Prigg. And again, when he was a private lawyer, Chase made arguments against Prigg, right? He was the one who came up with all these textual arguments. So I think DeWitt's an important case, like saying, yeah, we don't care about Prigg. Civil War, we don't care about this stuff anymore. We won, right? We don't need this sort of broad conception of federal power anymore. 1869, Civil War's over, we're done. So 14th Amendment ratified. Everyone see this, right? Now, without question, I think he ignored Prigg. So what is difficult about this class is at various points in time, the Supreme Court's taken different approaches to enumerated powers. Sometimes they're interpreted broadly, and sometimes they're interpreted narrowly. And what drives students nuts is it's not a straight line. All right, let me show you. I have this. I made this spreadsheet, which will go into the videos. Unfortunately, not for your semester. Still working on it. Still a work in progress. But I've tried, and my colleague Brandon tried to map out the dynamics. Let's see if this works. Oh no, there's no way I want to do it. I'll bring it up in a minute. It's not going to work now. Okay. All right. So everyone should get just the general holding of DeWitt, right? Yes. Yes. Good. Okay. Here's what I wanted to show you. Okay. So again, this is not perfect, but what I want to convey to you is that the court hasn't taken a consistent approach to enumerated powers. And I made this plot. It's like a time chart. Not perfect, but it illustrates the point somewhat. And at various points, you have either a broader or a more narrow conception of applied power. So one of the first debates was the first Bank of the United States, right? Remember, Jefferson had debate, and Hamilton had his position, and then Washington said, okay, we can charter the bank. So then you have the first bank. Then you have McCulloch, right, and Gibbons. And I think McCulloch went beyond. I can send it to you later. I'll take a picture of it. I appreciate the sentiment, though. I'll send it to you later. I remember when I was in college, I was trying to take a picture of notes, the professor got mad at me, so that didn't work anymore. Yeah. You tried that?
No, I was just showing her, I had drawn
The same thing you did, like yellow.
Mind meld, right? So, in McCulloch, Marshall went beyond what Hamilton said, because he added the word convenient. Remember, we made a big fuss about the word convenient. So I think McCulloch and Gibbons expanded beyond this. Then we go to Prigg, and Prigg shot all the way up, right? Prigg had this much broader conception of implied powers than did Marshall and McCulloch, and certainly that Washington and Hamilton had. Then we go back down to DeWitt. We'll do Hepburn in a minute, right? DeWitt's like, never mind, right? Zip, all the way down. And he basically ignores Prigg. I mean, you have to see, he doesn't even cite the case, right? If you're a justice of the court, and there's a really big case for necessary and proper, you at least mention it, you at least try and cite it. So at least in DeWitt and Hepburn. But then we go to Knox, which we'll cover in maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and Knox like, zoop. I think Knox is probably the broadest of any case ever decided. It's remarkably broad. And then we have E.C. Knight and Hammer, which we'll go through later in class. We'll come back to this, right? But as you go through this semester, and I'll send you this sheet later to take a look at it, I want you to keep in mind that constitutional law has not been a straight continuum. It's been almost like a sine wave in math. Remember this thing goes up and down? It's not consistent. And I'll just scroll to the right so you see the entire history. Justice Fuller moved over, unfortunately. But it goes bigger during the Progressive era, then the New Deal, and then the Warren Court, and then finally leading with the Obamacare decision. So eventually, We eventually got back up to where Prigg was almost, but it took 150 years to get there. I'll send you this later. Don't feel like you're compelled to copy it down. But I know what I can do. If I copy the link into the class notes, aha. All right, the link is in the class notes. You have it. That should work. If you click on it, it should open up. My goal is to actually animate that graph, which sounds a lot easier than it is, but it's really hard. But I want to have like all the columns going up and down so you can see it moving and visual, and like you can interact with it. It's going to be a big deal, which unfortunately you won't see. It kills me to give you a partial product because it's not ready yet, but you're my, beta test. I wasn't going to say guinea pig, but I was saying beta testers. You're my beta testers. But you guys are getting it for free, so that's the upshot. You have to pay for it. But hopefully we can get this for free for everyone. It'll still work. All right. So everyone get DeWitt, right? The sale of the oil itself is not commerce, and it's not a proper exercise of federal power to try to increase tax revenues. That's not proper. But one note, right? Kyle, let me ask you this question, Kyle. Can Congress tax the sale of goods within a single state? They can't regulate with commerce laws, but can they tax the sale of goods within a single state? So this is one thing to keep in mind. The taxing power is a lot broader than the commerce power. Let's say it again. The taxing power is a lot broader than the commerce power. What does that mean? Congress can't regulate the local sale of activity, but they can tax local activity. Keep that in mind for the Affordable Care Act case. Congress can't regulate your decision not to buy health insurance, but apparently they can tax you for going uninsured. This comes back to DeWitt. Important case no one studies. All right. You won't find this in other case books. It's a very important case. All right. Other questions on DeWitt? Okay. The next case, actually next two cases, Hepburn and, I always forget the other name. Hepburn and Knox. I always sort of blank on Knox. I don't know why. Okay. I'm sorry?
Knox wasn't a sine.
Night.
It's in the note. The thing about the Supreme Court becoming bigger. No, I didn't assign Knox. You're right.
Yeah.
No, you're all freaking out. No, I'm sorry. I don't assign. I don't assign Knox. It's not very. The summary of the Supreme Court flipping sides discusses it. So that's all you need to know. But we'll do Hepburn first, and then we'll discuss Knox. But thank you. Don't worry. I'm very careful in case I assign and don't assign. All right, Drew. You wanna give me please the facts in Hepburn?
Yeah, so Hepburn is dealing with Congress has enacted the Legal Tender Act, 1862, which allowed them to issue paper money.
Not just issue paper money, but what was the important point?
Also legal tender paper money, which would have allowed people to use paper money to cover their debts.
Very good. Okay, the important point is legal tender, right? If Congress wants to print paper money, they can do whatever they want, right? It's not worth anything. But if you look at any dollar bill, right? You take actually on my wallet with me, it's my office, but if you look at any dollar bill, it'll say this is legal tender. What does that actually mean? That if I go to any business and I say here's $1, use this to pay for it, they're required to accept it. Now, today we don't. Yeah, see, am I right? It's on there. You never noticed that before, did you? Yeah, it's on every piece of U.S. currency. This was controversial, though, right? Why was this controversial? Because paper money was worthless. People understood value in metal, silver, gold, right? There was an intrinsic value to it. But paper money was whatever. You don't know if this paper money is going to be worth anything. It can be inflated, it can be diminished, it can be repealed. So what happened was Congress said, we're in the middle of a civil war. We can't back over money with coins, with gold or silver, so we're going to print paper money. And in fact, Salmon Chase, it keeps me back to Chase, right? Salmon Chase was a Secretary of the Treasury, and his face was on the greenback. That's where it comes from. It's called a greenback, so it's green. He was on the first $1 bill. Not George Washington, it was actually Salmon Chase. As a trivia note, right, which two justices have been on U.S. currency? Salmon Chase and John Marshall. They were both on U.S. currency. If you're on Jeopardy, you'll know the answer. You never know. Okay? So what happens? The law says you're required to accept this money. Hepburn goes to the court because poor Miss Hepburn tried to pay a debt with this paper money, and Miss Griswold said, "Nope, not going to do it. Not going to accept these notes." Okay. So is it Delbert? Delbert. When Chase was the Secretary of the Treasury, he said Congress doesn't have the power to enact this law. Oh, sorry. When Chase was in government and the Secretary of the Treasury, he said Congress can do this. They put his face in the damn bill. What happened a couple years later? He was on the court.
Decided that he shouldn't have done that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll come back to you in a second, Delbert, for the facts, but isn't that a little weird, right? When you're the Secretary of the Treasury and you say, yeah, we need paper money, right? And then a couple years later, after the war's over, like, I changed my mind. People debate this. He probably thought it was necessary because of the war, and if they didn't have this paper money, they would become bankrupt. So, maybe he thought it was a necessity, but by 1870, he's like, no, we can't have this paper money anymore. All right, so Delbert, what was Chase's argument for why Congress couldn't require legal tender for paper money?
Because it was not enumerated in the Constitution.
Okay, very good. Is there any power for Congress to print paper money? Which clause?
Is there one that they can create?
Well, actually, it's the power to coin money, and that referred not to print money, but actually metal, right? I think the video has a thing. What's a dollar? A dollar actually referred to this silver Spanish coin. That's what a dollar was. So the word coin money, it referred to metal, not paper, which you can print on your own printing press. So Delbert, could the power to coin money get you to legal tender, according to the Chief Justice? No, why not? Is there any express enumerated power that lets you print money? Okay. So, is that Jason? Jason, so if there's no express enumerated power, is that the end of the case? We stop there? Now, what do we look at?
Necessary and proper.
Necessary and proper. Now, you're right. Chase goes to the necessary and proper clause, but does he even need to? Right, Jason? Let's go back to a necessary and proper clause. It says, where is it? Congress shall have the power to pass necessary and proper laws to execute the foregoing powers. What are we linking up with here? What does the necessary and proper clause link up with here? Which enumerated powers link up with?
Coin money?
So you said coin is metal, gold. I'll give an answer for this one, actually. Anyone take a stab? This is actually a hard question.
What?
What enumerated power would necessary and proper work with here? Yeah.
The power to issue the notes?
Which power is that? Where is that? Is that a clause?
No.
No. Mine?
Does it have something to do with taking away somebody's property? And not-
Well, it does. It's actually a taking of property. Yeah.
Power
Mark.
to fix the standards of weight and measure.
Good guess. That's actually about make sure a pound is a pound. I don't think that refers to money, but very good guess. Yeah, sir, Jim.
Borrowing money?
Maybe borrowing. Marcus?
Has something to do with enforcing contracts?
There's a contracts clause. Andrew?
Is it to raise and support armies?
Maybe. Gary?
Is it to pay off the debts and provide common defense?
I think it's probably a combination of borrowing money and paying off debts. It's probably my best bet. I think that's probably the best one. Maybe taxing power. But you hook it to something, right? Think of you're a train, right? You got to hook your carriage to the engine, the locomotive, and then you have a caboose all the way at the end, right? So you have this power to borrow money. That's your locomotion, and then you have this little thing, this little caboose hanging on the tail end. So the question is this a proper exercise of federal power, right? He doesn't overturn McCulloch. He doesn't really discuss whether it's necessary. but is this a proper action? Is this appropriate? Ross, what does Chase hold here? Is this an appropriate exercise of federal power?
I said no because it was not in the spirit of the Constitution.
It's not in the spirit of the Constitution. Why is that?
Because it's not right for someone to accept less than what they really should have been given in the first place.
Yeah, again, this is basically a proper analysis, right? It connects with coining money, maybe borrowing money, maybe raising taxes. So it's probably helpful to the U.S. economy to have this, but it's not in the spirit of the Constitution. Now, there's this phrase, it's not within the spirit of the Constitution. What the heck does that mean? Jessica, I got your name right. Good.
Like it's not within like the Constitution's like intended purpose, like what they meant by that.
So now we're moving away from text and going back to purpose, right? How do you know what the purpose of the Constitution is? How does Marshall, I keep saying Marshall, how does Chase know what the purpose of the Constitution is? How do you know what the spirit of the seance, right? How do you know, what do we Ouija board James Madison? I mean, what do we do here? How do you know what the spirit of the Constitution is? Doesn't anyone know what it is?
I guess looking back to, I guess, kind of what they intended and
How do we know? There were lots of people with lots of different thoughts in their minds. They all had different intents. Hundreds of people at this convention, right? Lots of people voted on it. How do we know? Marcus?
States' rights to regulate within their own jurisdictions.
So how do we know that? Where do we get that from? Where does Chase get that from? Yeah, Yara?
he says the states have always been held to possess the power to authorize and regulate the issue of bills for circulation by banks.
So he gets it from the structure of the Constitution, right? He says that the state police power concerns issuers of paper money, not the federal government. And he also mentioned the 10th Amendment, right? And we don't talk much about the 10th Amendment, but the 10th Amendment says if a power is not delegated to the federal government, it's reserved to the states. Conversely, we know this is a state power, therefore it's not a federal power. So he kind of works backwards. It's not a clean shot, right? I mean, if you take McCulloch and Prigg as correct, then this case has to be wrong. But if you take DeWitt as correct, then this case is fine. Which is why on my magical timeline, I put DeWitt and Hepburn at roughly the same level as McCulloch. Not perfect, but roughly the same level. But man, you got Prigg over there. Prigg was all the way up there. So again, Chase is not acting, I think, consistent with Prigg, which he probably thought was wrong. He doesn't overturn it, doesn't overrule it, but he's not acting consistent with it. Everyone okay? Everyone just with me on that, more or less, right? So the court holds that Congress cannot require legal tender. They cannot require people to accept this paper money. That's not a proper exercise of federal power. He doesn't say that exactly, but that's the assumption, right? There's no express power to have legal tender, and it's not within the implied power. But you know what I mean with express and implied? An express power is enumerated, it's listed. Implied power, like in this chart, is through the necessary and proper clause. It's implied. It's not direct, it's suggested. It relates back to coining money and borrowing money and commerce and whatever else you want. So again, Prigg, really broad conception of necessary and proper, and then DeWitt and Hepburn, I think, is fairly low. And just imagine these columns like animating up and moving left and right and all this cool stuff. It's gonna look fantastic. I'm gonna probably convey this to my designer who had to build this. You're not guinea pigs, that's very They're my students, you're learning. I'm learning too. You never believe me. I learn more from you than you learn from me. I know you don't believe that, but it's very true. I always learn a lot from everyone in this class. So I appreciate it. All right. So everyone get the holding then in Hepburn. Okay. You're right. I did not assign Knox because it's not very important. But the upshot is, within about a year and change of Hepburn being decided, the composition of the Supreme Court changed very rapidly. Indeed, when Hepburn was decided, they were down to a 7-member court. There were 8 members when it was argued, and then between what was argued and decided, 1 member dropped off. So the final vote in Hepburn was 4-3. By the way, all this debate, is the size of the Supreme Court fixed at 9. The Supreme Court doesn't have a fixed size in the Constitution. But one question is, if you have 9 justices, what value does a majority opinion with 4 have? Right? Is a majority opinion with 4 votes binding? And it's actually a fairly tough question. If you don't have a majority of the justices, how do you have a binding opinion? We'll do one case later this semester to 4-3, and we'll discuss it. There was actually a case last year, 2 years ago, that was a 4-2 vote. That it was during the period where Justice Scalia had passed away, and I think Kagan and Sotomayor recused. So basically a 4-2 court. I mean, what the heck's the value of a 4-2 court? But we had a case like that. It's in your book called Ziegler versus Abbasi, Ziglar. I think it's 4-2. Check. Am I right about that one? You know?
No, the name sounds familiar.
It was a case actually stemming from 9/11. It was the same facts as Iqbal. Remember Iqbal v. Twombly? No. Iqbal v. Ashcroft, I'm sorry. Iqbal v. Ashcroft, the same case from Iqbal about whether people who were detained after 9/11 had a cause of action against the federal government for abuse. The court tossed out their claim in 2015 or 16. It's in your book, Ziegler versus Abbasi. I don't think it's on your syllabus, though. I taught last year, though. All right, so again, we get to Knox v. Lee. What changed? You have 3 new justices. I'm sorry, 2 new justices who were both paper money in favor of it, and the court upheld it. And the court's opinion adopted this very broad conception of implied powers. I think even broader than Prigg. People can debate about that, but it's a very broad notion of implied powers. And they basically reversed the court 1 year later. Now, just a riddle for a minute, right? A riddle. Did Hepburn invalidate the Legal Tender Act? Jesse. Did Hepburn invalidate? I mean, I thought it did. Didn't Hepburn say that the Legal Tender Act is unconstitutional?
It did, but only.
How can it be unvalidated? If you invalidate a law, how can you reanimate it? How does that work?
Well, from what I understand, with Hepburn, it's only going to be that individual. She can.
Are you telling me the Supreme Court decision only applies to the parties in the case?
Well, it's technically reversed with Knox then.
So does Knox only apply to Knox and Lee? Does it apply to anyone else?
It don't apply to anyone else until it's reversed again at the Supreme Court.
Why?
Because that's how it works.
I'm sorry?
The law's still there.
It's not going to change.
Judges can't.
Wait a minute, don't judges strike laws off the books?
No, just like in the situation that comes up is when they can make a ruling on that. But they can't say this law is gone forever now.
Judges can't. I think that this conversation last week, didn't we? So Jesse made a fair point. I think Marquia, you're next. Asian countries next. Do you like to object away?
No, no.
She's throwing under the bus?
No, I'm not her. No.
Okay, so I don't want to be answering this question. I'll put this whoever wants. Okay. Marquia. How can a law be unconstitutional 1 year and then unconstitutional the next year, right? How can it be unconstitutional in 1 year and then the next year becomes constitutional again? How's that even possible?
Well, the Supreme Court has the power to, there's precedents, so you can follow that or they have the power to overturn it.
But if the Supreme Court already said this act is unconstitutional, how can there be another case? Why would anyone even try to enforce this law? It's a good question. Want to try that?
So they, the Supreme Court should decide if they want to hear. If like it's something.
But how does the case arise though, right?
Well, if somebody doesn't have the issue with the fact that.
But why would the issue be the same? If the court said this statute is unconstitutional, why would anyone even try and hand out paper money anymore?
Because they agree with it not being constitutional and they majority.
Say it loud.
We can't hear you down here.
Louder up here so I can hear you. So your friends up front can hear you.
They decide, they may not agree.
So people can go ahead and challenge Supreme Court decision. How? By saying, take my paper money. Right? Yeah. This is an aspect of law that most students will never grasp. Courts do not have an eraser. Right? They can't erase a statute out of a book. The Legal Tender Act was a statute and it was still in the books. The court held that between Hepburn and Griswold, you can't enforce a statute. And then 2 years later, in the Knox and Lee case, said, okay, but you can enforce it here. But the Supreme Court doesn't, you're going to get mad at me, does not declare the supreme law of the land. They can't. If the Supreme Court declared the supreme law of the land, then Hepburn's a final word. It can't be overturned. That's it. The law is gone. You can never get rid of it. But the fact that one court could reverse another one demonstrates that the court's decisions are only limited scope. In this case, illustrates it perfectly, because in the span of like 2 years, they completely reverse directions. Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of just a historical question. Like, is this the beginning of like credit and things like that?
What do you mean credit?
I guess in the sense of you don't have enough money to pay your debts, and so you're paying on credit. Is this kind of the beginning of that?
No, there was paper money at the time of the founding, but the states issued it.
Okay.
And lots of states issued what's called scrip, like SCRIP. It was just paper money. It wasn't worth anything. It was worthless. But now it was the federal government issuing this paper money, which was required to be accepted coast to coast. And now it's a big deal, right? Mm-hmm. If a state made you accept paper money, whatever. But now, if you were a debtor in one state, you had to accept this worthless paper money. Make sense? But just back to the point, right? The courts only resolve conflicts between A and B. People could choose to follow it as precedent, but Kenesha said it correctly. Someone said, I don't think this is the right case, take my paper money, or else. The government kept printing the paper money even after Knox. Hepburn. Even after Hepburn, the federal government still kept printing paper money. You say, wait a minute, the court said this can't be legal tender, why still printing it? Right? Why still? People said it was wrong. And the president put 2 new judges in the court who accepted this reasoning. And they were known to accept paper money. They understood this. So this is a very important case in the doctrine of enumerated powers, but also illustrates how the court can not actually create the supreme law of the land. And let me just make this point a little bit more finite. A case you're probably familiar with, Lawrence versus Texas, right? About sodomy. Texas had a law saying sodomy is a crime. The Supreme Court said that law is unconstitutional. Is that law still in the statute books? Yeah, it's there. Little footnote says, declared unconstitutional in Lawrence v. Texas, but it's still there. And if for whatever reason, the Supreme Court declares it, that statute's still in the books, can be enforced. So courts do not erase statutes. They can't do it. They're not able to, which is why I'm going to make a habit of stop saying the court struck down the law. I don't want to say it ever again. I'm sure I'm going to say it and slip, but I want to stop using that phrase. So you say the court declared the law unconstitutional. That's fine. But courts can't strike down laws. And your book says nullify. I'm going to change every single one of those in the next edition. It's driving me nuts. I have one of my RAs with the track changes. It's a lot of them. But anyway, so just for to indulge me, just say declare unconstitutional. I think that's fine. Or declare void. I think that's a fair way of saying it. Yes,
I'm curious with the history of the Knox case.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chase was still the Chief Justice at this time.
Yes.
And they only replaced with 2 other people. So one person left.
The vote was 4-3,
right.
And then they added 2 more, so we became 5-4 the other way.
Okay, so it'd be curious to know why, if you may know, why would they even accept the case? Why would the Knox case? Why would they accept it even
so 2 things. First, once the 5 were confirmed, there was an effort to just rehear the other case, right? You can basically reconsider a case. And they thought, no, that's not bad. So they just waited for another case to come to the pipeline. So you can imagine, right? They had 5. There were 4 on Monday, right? And on Tuesday, there were 5 the other way. You say, oh, you know what? Let's just rehear Hepburn v. Griswold. And they decided not to do that. They waited for another case. But it's transparent, right? It's absolutely transparent what's going on. And the second, I think it's basically about a year later. It wasn't that much later. It was 71. So the next year, they had another case. Because again, to Kenesha's point, someone still tried to get the paper money accepted. And that created a controversy. It was a total settlement, right? It was a total settlement. Yes, Kenesha.
So Can't the, court decide that they want to, the Supreme Court can decide that they want to, like, if they, if they hear, of a case or something, they can say, oh yeah, they not want to hear that, because if they know that they have the opportunity to then reverse the decision that earlier the Supreme Court had decided.
Yeah, the Supreme Court can't manufacture the case, but they can pick and choose
But
the
they
case.
can pick, they can decide that they want to allow that case to come.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and today the Supreme Court has a purely discretionary docket. They can pick and choose their cases. Back then, it was not a discretionary docket. They can pick which cases to do what they want. They still have some discretion. Okay, they're with me so far.
So again, the chronology, implied powers, Marshall slightly expands upon what Hamilton did with Washington, but then you had Prigg with the Slave Act. Chase tried to hold the line a little bit in DeWitt and Hepburn, but then you got to Knox where they said, screw it. We're going to have a really broad conception of implied powers. And I think Knox went beyond Prigg, because at least there was a clause about future slaves or something connected. Here, there's nothing of paper money to make people accept it. It's a stretch. Right? You can have a bank, but you can't make people use it. There's a difference. Yeah, Andrew?
Treasury bonds were payable in paper money.
I'm sorry?
Treasury bonds, like from the Civil War, were payable in paper money.
Is that right? There was another famous case in the 1930s I want to teach called the Gold Clause case. The Gold Clause case. It used to be that you could take any piece of paper money and bring it to a treasury and they'll give you gold. And then President Roosevelt said, no more. We're going to just get rid of this gold value. So was that a constitution? Was it taking a property? Huge case. But the court said that you no longer can take a U.S. currency note and bring it to a treasury and get gold out of it. I'm sorry? You'd have a very heavy wallet, yeah.
That's a heavy wallet.
Very heavy wallet, yeah. Yeah, Jeremy.
With regards to that, did that also, because of that, facilitate our move from the gold standard?
That was part of the move with the gold standard, exactly. Yeah, it used to be you could take any piece of federal currency, paper money, go to a treasury, and they give you gold for it. Can't do that anymore. Kyle?
Well, so that kind of makes his case a lot more silly, right? If he could have just taken the money that he didn't want to accept to a bank and said, give me the equivalent amount of gold, as opposed to going to...
I don't know if at this point you had that option. At least in the 30s you did, but I'm not sure if at this point you could change the paper money versus gold. My guess during Civil War you couldn't. That might come around later. But it's a good insight.
I'm going to kill myself with this thing. Put a pillow or something on this corner. I'm going to get like a baby-proof room. Any other questions on Knox or Hepburn or Griswold? Hepburn or Knox? Yeah, Tanisha.
No, not only that. I missed on DeWitt. You said that general holding something not proper. You said the general holding was something.
Not proper.
It was.
I don't know what I said.
You said it was not proper to prevent it. The local sale of oil is not commerce, and it was not proper to prevent the sale to exercise their tax power.
Right. That there was no commerce involved. That selling oil to one state was not commerce among the states, and that they can't link that transaction to the taxing power. That if you prevent these goods, you'll raise taxes from the other goods. Right. That was not. That was too remote. Couldn't link it together. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. I think Marquis next. We'll come to in a minute. Because we have this little commentator for it. Okay. I'm sorry? Your co-counsel. I like that. Okay. All right. So we move forward. Right on schedule. So Chase court ended in the 1872. I think Chase died in 1873. Just Google me on that. But I think he died in 73 or 74. Might be off by a year. After Chase died, the Supreme Court went through somewhat of a not very important period. There weren't too many big cases in the 1880s. There were some, but we'll do them later. But in the 1890s and early 1900s, a period began that's known as the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era. What is the Progressive Era? It's, I think, very hard to define. It is not a single time frame. It might begin in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s, 20s. It's hard to nail down. But the way I like to describe the progressive era is they say progress. Now, is it good progress or bad progress? I'll let you decide. But they were making progress. And they were trying to use the power of the states and federal governments to impose laws to regulate the economy, health measures, safety measures, wage, hour, food, everything you can think of. The entire notion of a regulatory state was an unknown quantity in the 1870s. The idea that the government would regulate food conditions. If you ever read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, how our slaughterhouses operated. That the government would regulate wages. That the government would regulate manufacturing conditions. That the state would try and prohibit alcohol, prohibition. That the state would try to regulate lottery tickets. That the government would try to regulate monopoly and try and keep businesses small again, right? That the government would try to prohibit improper breeding. We'll do a case later this semester called Buck v. Bell, which involved mandatory sterilization. These were all parts of the same movement. The idea of using the power of the state to improve society. And again, you can agree whether these improvements or not. But it was using state power in ways. We'll do Buck v. Bell later. You'll get there. Just read ahead, you'll see it. It was a case that involved compulsory sterilization. But it was all from the same era, the progressives. It's a mixed bag, progressives. You might like labor laws, but you don't like sterilization laws. So it's a mixed bag. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. People often only see the good parts of progressive, but there were some dark parts as well. Buck v. Bell, we'll get there in the second half of this.
Oh, you got me totally curious now.
Well, it's a short case, you can read it. Okay, so that brings us to E.C. Knight. E.C. Knight was a case about the regulation of the national economy. And towards the end of the 19th century, the movement was big. How to make bigger businesses, consolidate everything, try to stifle competition, maybe raise prices, although generally the monopolies didn't raise prices as much as they were thought that certain economies of scale, but not important. Okay. Markia, could you please give us the facts in United States versus E.C. Knight?
Right. So during this case, there was the enactment of the Permanent Antitrust Act, which was basically an effort to prevent monopolies in the trade. So in this case, the American Sugar Refining Company had essentially bought out or tried to buy out all the other sugar manufacturers to control the monopoly of sugar. And the fact said that it was like 98% of the monopoly of all American sugar. So basically the government sued the E.C. Knight company to stop them from, or basically to suppress the transaction with American Sugar Refining. And so that's it.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Markia. So let's be clear about what this law did and didn't do. The Sherman Antitrust Act prohibited combining companies of a certain undetermined size. It didn't say how big, but you couldn't combine to create a monopoly, right? Lucas, did this law, I'm sorry, not Lucas, Lucian, I assumed the second half of the name, and I didn't say it.
I like to hear people pronounce it.
What's that?
I like to hear people.
How do you pronounce it?
Lucian.
Lucian. Like an SH.
Like solution.
Lucian. Okay, I'll try to remember that, Lucian. There's a famous Supreme Court case called Lujan, L-U-J-A-N. And everyone says Lujan, but it's actually Lujan, so you're Lucian. Okay. Lucian, did this law regulate how sugar has to be manufactured in terms of safety conditions and how you keep your machines clean and stuff?
No. It mentions trade and commerce and monopoly.
Did this law actually regulate the shipment of sugar between two states?
It was talking about trade and commerce among several states.
But what was the trigger, though, of this law? In other words, what triggered a violation of this law? Was it that sugar would be shipped from one state to another?
That four companies were combining to be one.
Ah. Okay. So Jeremy, here's my question. Go back to Gibbons, right? How did Gibbons define commerce?
Well, intercourse between states.
Well, and how they define among?
Among, between the states,
Very
between the
good.
several states.
So is this case about commerce or intercourse, or is it about something else?
This case is about something else. This case is about the ability of one organization to control, in this case, sugar, and have a monopoly over it without, an unfair competition. And that was where the Sherman antitrust law comes.
That's right. This case was about one firm manufacturing a high percentage of sugar in the marketplace. And under the rule in Gibbons, this was not commerce. This was not intercourse. So the Supreme Court says that this is not commerce, and Congress cannot regulate it in this fashion. Okay? That's probably correct. If you want to take Gibbons for what it's worth, it's fine. And by the way, to this day, Gibbons is still good law, right? One of the remarkable aspects about my timeline here is the definition of commerce has remained almost identical. The court hasn't really expanded what commerce means, but instead they've expanded the implied powers. So, James, let me ask you this question. Does the majority consider the necessary and proper clause here?
A little bit, yes. They state that it's necessary for the good of the country to limit the power as far as pricing for one industry.
Okay, so the court says this, right? The power to control manufacturing might control its disposition, right? So Justin, if you control manufacturing, what are you probably controlling down the road? What comes after manufacturing? What happens after you make sugar? What do you do with it?
You sell it.
Oh, thanks, Justin. Yeah, exactly. You sell it.
You said Justin, right?
I did. I laughed. You're fine. Thanks, Justin. I was looking at him, and then this came out of nowhere.
Well,
I was
I'm a
like,
little confused there, but
just go with it when you're there. So Justin's right. Because it's 2 J's. It's 9 o'clock. Okay, so we're almost there. So Justin's correct. After you manufacture the sugar, you're probably going to ship it. Some of it might be shipped internally within the state. Some of it might be shipped to another state. Some of it might be shipped overseas. So the court says there's probably a disposition. There's probably going to be shipment of the sugar. But here's the key point. The commerce, the intercourse, happens after the manufacturing. Right? He says commerce succeeds to manufacture. So what does that mean? First you make it, and then you ship it. You got to make it first, and you have to ship it. This law is not about the shipment of it. It's about the manufacture. And Congress cannot regulate the manufacturing. In other words, the shipping is a secondary sense, but the primary sense is manufacturing. And Congress cannot go there. And it discusses this indirect test, right? Is this a direct regulation of commerce or an indirect regulation of commerce? And I'll tell you, it's indirect, right? Because, well, you make it here, then maybe you ship it overstate tomorrow. The court says you cannot have this indirect effect on Congress. Now, Andrew, what case does this remind you of, this direct, indirect test? What does this seem similar to? We've covered it today.
The taxing one. The outlawing lamp oil.
Good, DeWitt. And if you notice, I put DeWitt and Knight at roughly the same level, right? Because what did Chase say? It was too remote. The connection between banning the sale of oil and the taxing power is too remote. Or you get that indirect. So really, E.C. Knight, I think, is around the same level as was DeWitt. There was too remote, too weak, too attenuated connection between the enumerated power, commerce or tax, and regulation at hand. Right? There's too much of a gap between regulating monopolies and regulating the shipments. Now, could Congress ban the shipment of certain types of sugar in interstate commerce? Yeah, they can do that. But they can't prohibit the corporations that manufacture it. that goes too far. Right? The power to regulate commerce is independent of the power to suppress monopoly, unless the transaction itself is a monopoly of commerce. They can regulate the trade, but they can't regulate the manufacture. And this they get from Gibbons. The states have the power over police in their own borders. It's not for Congress. If a state wants to regulate monopoly, it's for the states to accomplish. And keep that in mind. Even where you have the court saying the feds can't do it, the states still can. For example, the court struck down federal child labor laws, but they never struck down state child labor laws. This is often lost. The states had a broader power to do certain things that the feds could not. So we'll get the majority, right? Commerce comes first. Manufacture comes first. Commerce comes second. Go with me on the majority opinion. The dissent is by Justice John Marshall Harlan, and he's very famous. He was called the Great Dissenter. He wrote a famous dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson. He wrote a famous dissent in the civil rights cases. He dissented here. He dissented in a case called Lochner v. New York, a very famous case. He wrote a lot of very important dissents. And Marshall was, he was named after John Marshall. His name was John Marshall Harlan. John Marshall Harlan was very forward-looking, and he often wrote stuff that would become law years later. So what is Harlan's point in dissent? Does he think that Congress has the power to enact this law? I'm sorry, louder, so people up front can hear you.
Yes, he does.
Thank you. Tell me why.
Well, he brings up the necessary and proper clause.
Yeah. And walk me through the necessary and proper argument.
So the ends, first he says it's the ends, and the goals here of this this act is protection of trade and commerce among the states against unlawful restraints, and the means, and so they're legitimate. And then the means, would be appropriate.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. So he looks at the means, the ends, and he brings up a test from McCulloch, Maryland. He says, look, this is going back to John Marshall, right? The guy he was named after. This goes back to John Marshall, right? The Constitution gives Congress the power to protect commerce among the states, and then they can prohibit the stuff that gets there. In other words, why does Congress have to wait till this monopoly sugar is made to prohibit its shipment? Why can't they cut it off at the beginning? And think about this for a minute, right? Everyone agrees. Congress would say you can't ship this sugar across state lines. Then what's the point? You make all this sugar, what are you going to do with it? So why can't you just take another step forward and say, we're going to make you not prohibit in the first place, right? You can't make in the first place, therefore you're talking about being shipped. Why doesn't Congress have that latitude, that discretion to stop this in the bud, right? To stop at the earlier level, right? So Harlan would say that the necessary and proper clause, acting in conjunction with the Commerce Clause, gives Congress the power to enact this law. Let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. There's that phrase, right? Jason said a minute ago, the letter and spirit of the Constitution. How is a judge, Austin, how is a judge to know what the letter and spirit of the Constitution are? Chase thought it meant one thing. Harlan just means something else. Who's right? Chase or Harlan? Who's right about the letter and spirit of the Constitution?
They both could be right.
How do we know what the letter and spirit? I mean, Chase said the spirit is one thing, and then Harlan said something else. Who's at fault here, right? Who's at fault here?
I'm not sure, but one of them is at fault.
I blame John Marshall. Because we have this stupid test that doesn't really mean anything. Right? That's Marshall's problem. This all stems back to John Marshall. It's all his fault, right? He puts up this test. Oh, the letter and spirit of the Constitution, easy, right? No, it doesn't mean anything, right? So this is why even though I think Hamilton had the better argument, I'd go back to Madison because it's easier to apply. But you have here this test. What Harlan said becomes the rule, right? Harlan's dissent in E.C. Knight is where the law is today. The majority opinion in E.C. Knight is not good law anymore, but we're still going to study it. Right? So the majority said this isn't commerce, and Congress can't regulate indirect effects on commerce. The dissent says, no, Congress has a latitude to prevent this monopoly sugar from being created in the first place. They can stop it. Yes, Joel? Is that a hand? Okay, that's fine. I do that all the time. If you see me talking to myself, just have Bluetooth in, it's a little bit less weird. Okay. When I write, I actually speak out loud as I type, so it's just, you'll hear me if you walk my office. I'm always talking to myself. It helps me think. When I responded, that's the problem. Any questions in EC Knight? Let's go to the next one. The next case is Champion versus Ames. And you can see them in a little graph already. Preview. Champion, Ames, and Hammer go up a little bit, go up to the next level, so you can see where this is headed. Harlan was in dissent in EC Knight, 5-4. Then, about 8 years later, it flips. And Harlan's the majority in a 5-4 opinion. And basically just one vote flipped. I can't remember who it was, but one vote flipped. I think new justice added to the court. So basically 5-4 one way, 5-4 the other way. Going way up to, Nisha, yes. Can you give me the facts, please, in the lottery? It's called a lottery case also. It's involved lottery tickets. But the facts in Champion versus Ames.
So in this case, the appellants were indicted for lottery tickets across state lines from Texas to California. And so it was in violation of a 1895 congressional act which prohibits sending the lottery tickets from one state to another by any means. And so they were insisting that carrying the tickets from one state to another by an express company that was engaging in freight packages, although they were containing box packages, did not constitute a violation of the act.
Okay, very good. Is that Brooke?
Oh.
So Brooke, let me ask you a question. Is a lottery ticket commerce?
No.
Then what's commerce here? What does Harlan find as commerce?
The instrumentality.
Instrumentality, what's that?
In freight engaged in
Very good. So the lottery ticket by itself isn't commerce. However, the transportation of the lottery ticket from one state to the other is commerce. He says the carrying from one state to the other by independent carriers of things or commodities, is that not commerce? In a very odd way of writing, it's a little hard to read, but he was, sort of this hypothetical question that he sort of answered himself. What was that, Brooke? Yeah. Yeah. So he says that this involves the regulation of commerce. But, Yaron, there's another point here. Does this statute regulate the transportation of lottery tickets? Is it merely saying how you have to transport them, the conditions you have to do?
No.
No, it goes beyond that. What does it do?
Well, it says the regulation.
What exactly does the statute do, right? What happened to Indigo? What happened to the people in this case who were involved?
Well, they were because they moved it from state to state.
Right, again, so, Yaron, does the statute regulate the shipment of lottery tickets?
No.
What did it do?
Prohibits.
Oh. What did it do?
It just prohibited.
Prohibited it. So, Yaron, your final question. Does the power to regulate include the power to prohibit?
I would assume it does.
Why would you assume? You can. Is there a difference, Yaron, between regulating commerce and prohibiting commerce?
Well, that's basically the question they have.
Yes, thank you. Okay, very good. So, Carrie, is there a difference between regulating commerce and prohibiting commerce?
I mean, yeah, prohibiting means that you completely stop it.
So, does the power to regulate commerce also allow them to prohibit it altogether? What does Harlan say?
No, they said that Congress has the authority to prohibit, or not prohibit it, but to only do it.
That's what the majority says? Danny? What does the majority say?
They say that Congress can.
Yeah. So this was actually a fairly big deal, right? You think, of course, if they can regulate, there was a debate. Can you prohibit? And the court says, yes, you can prohibit. And they say, look, if lotteries is a pestilence, right? A pestilence, like a plague, it infests the whole community, preys from the hard earnings of the poor, plunders the ignorant, my God, with Powerball like $500 million every day, right? It preys on the poor. That the government can take into view the evils that adhere. In other words, Congress doesn't have to let these tickets exist at all, that they can take a step forward and ban it, because it's injurious to the public morals. Okay? So this was really a majority opinion that was premised on commerce as well as necessary and proper, right? That under the Commerce Clause, you can regulate interstate commerce, but then you can ban it. Ban the tickets altogether with necessary and proper. I said again, I think I said it wrong. With the Commerce Clause, they can regulate the tickets, but they can then ban them altogether with necessary and proper. That gives them that extra oomph, that extra power. Right? And Harlan says, look, we don't need to lay down a bright line rule. Yeah, there are no bright line rules in this class, I'm sorry. We don't have them. They don't exist. There are no bright line rules. There are no bright line rules, but this case is enough. Lottery tickets are subjects of traffic from one state to another, and the Congress has authority to prohibit them with the Commerce plus necessary and proper clause. Okay. Everyone understand the majority opinion in a lottery ticket case? By the way, this is still good law today, lottery ticket case. Still good law. You can cite it. Oh, and just one other note. I probably mentioned this already, but on my exam, the final exam, there are always two questions, two fact patterns, right? One fact pattern is set in the present day, and another fact pattern set at some point in the distant past. It could be 1912, 1868, 1842, and the rub is you can only cite cases that have been decided by that point. So you need to know at a given point in time what is the state of constitutional law. That's why this timeline is actually very helpful for you, which I think will be good for your notes while making it. Right? Yeah.
Is it precise? Like, if you give us 1902 and this case was decided in 1903, then
That's it. That's
okay.
it. Yeah.
I realize these are notes.
Your books are open. Won't help you though.
That include notes.
You can use whatever you want. Bring whatever you want as long as it's printed. It will not help you. The only thing that might help you is the names of cases and years. That might be the only thing that helps you. The years will help you, and this timeline might be helpful also. But your notes won't be very helpful to you. Yeah, Kanisha.
So for the past, when we write, it's supposed to be like, so if I was here and you just want the cases to be set in that timeline.
You know what happened later, right? Yep, 1903 hasn't happened yet. You know what's going to happen now. You have to limit yourself to what the law was at that time. Trust me, this will teach you common in a way you don't understand other classes. You have to understand the arc. It's a trajectory. It's a history. It's not a straight line. I want to pinpoint what was the law here. That's what you have to do.
I'm going to say it's kind of the same thing you did in Civil Code.
Was it? I did it in Civil Code.
That false.
Well, this is what we have, so you're stuck with it. You don't have much of a choice, I'm sorry. But if you look at my old exam, you'll see it works. Yaron?
Is it because we were in the progressive era that he goes on to say when considering legislation for the suppression of violence, he talks about taking to view the evil?
Morals, exactly. It's about morality. Yeah. I mean, banning alcohol, banning lottery tickets, these were new exercises of progressive power. Usually the state says do whatever you want. It's not a problem. But they're trying to ban all this stuff. All the fun stuff like lotteries and booze and gambling and everything. Kanisha?
So, but you said in that case, the lottery case is still good law.
Still good law.
So, I could buy a lottery ticket in California.
Because Congress has repealed its federal prohibition on lottery tickets. The case is good law, not that lottery tickets are still banned.
Okay, not that the policy, just.
Yeah.
So is this sort of like a push towards the interfering with the police powers of the states? Is this where it starts sort of?
Yeah. I mean, look at my graph here, right? Knight was here, and then Champion comes up a little bit.
Okay.
It starts pushing up.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean.
So even though this is good, still good law, it's all kind of there's the arc and everything. Is that, like, on your exam, it doesn't necessarily matter if you give us a timeline that's after this, and this is still good law. Like, judges can kind of.
You can fit it in, yeah. The same way that Chase ignored Prigg,
That's what I was thinking.
Hammer ignores Champion. Right? So let me sum the dissent in I'll do the dissent quickly in Champion v. Ames. The dissent says this will destroy the distinction between the federal government and the state government. Right? It's very dramatic. He's saying if this is the rule, if now the federal government can regulate lottery tickets, there's no line. Right? There's no distinction between what the feds can do and what the states can do. Okay? There's no limiting principle. It breaks down the difference between that which is the commerce and that which is not. It also says regulate doesn't mean prohibit. Okay? So the view, the dissent in Champion v. Ames would not carry the day there. But fast forward a few more years to 1918. What am I up to? Yeah, Tricia. Want to give me the facts, please, in Hammer versus Dagenhart?
So this was, a father was bringing a claim, bringing court to try and protect his two minor sons.
Protect his sons from what?
Child labor.
No. He wasn't protecting them from child labor.
Wanting to work.
Okay, let me take a step back here. Everyone understand the facts in this case, right? He wanted his kids to work. Now, he's a father of the year, right? But let me just provide a qualified defense. If you were poor and you were hungry and your children were able, the law said you couldn't have them work. You say, oh, why don't my kids go to school? There was no welfare back then. Right? There was no Medicaid. There was no food stamps. If you didn't work, you starved. You were have to go on the charity roll. So the issue of child labor, I went to George Mason for law school, which is a very law and economics school. My econ final exam was write an essay justifying child labor. That's my final exam. But the point to dwell on here is there were people who needed their kids to work to make food. It was probably awful for the children, and they weren't getting educated. I think I have some pictures on the videos about them. But there are people who wanted them. So poor Mr. Hammer wanted his kids, 14, 16, to be able to work at a cotton mill. But the law limited and prohibited them from working as many hours they wanted. So this was actually the father bringing the suit on behalf of the kids so that they could work. And he argued that the federal child labor law is unconstitutional. Again, this was not a state child labor law. This was a federal child labor law. Okay? So Tricia, what did the court do with this federal child labor law?
They said that it was not upheld because this was seen as a competitive issue about workplace conditions.
Was child labor, the thing being banned, commerce among the several states? No. It was not. Why not?
It was internal.
But was it commerce? Was actually child labor commerce?
No, it was not.
What was it?
Part of the manufacturing.
Manufacturing. What did we say a few minutes ago? First comes manufacture, then comes commerce. Congress could regulate the actual shipment of goods made with child labor, perhaps. There's another case that says maybe they can't. But they can't regulate the manufacture. And Tricia said it correctly. The question of manufacturing conditions was solely a matter of state law and not federal law. So the majority opinion, Hammer versus Dagenhart, matches with the dissent in Champion versus Ames. They make very similar points. That if Congress can regulate workplace conditions, there is no line, there is no limiting principle between what the states can do and what the federal government can do. And they try and distinguish Champion v. Ames from other cases, but you know, it's basically saying we're going back to the Champion dissent, and let's just be, you know, we can be frank about it, right? This is not about regulating commerce, and because it's not about regulating commerce, you have to go necessary and proper, and they say this is not a proper exercise of federal power. It's a matter for states. It's not consistent with the spirit of the Constitution you can say. It's reserved for the states to do this. Okay, so any questions in the majority in Hammer? Dusty, back all the way around. Look at that. Yeah, this is a small enough class. I think you do everyone at least once. It doesn't always work that way. Dusty, tell me about the dissent in Hammer by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. We love Holmes. He had a wonderful mustache. It was divine.
So Justice Holmes says that the act does not meddle with anything belonging to the states. And that they regulate their own internal affairs and their domestic commerce as they like.
Very good. Dusty, does Holmes see any difference between this case and Champion v. Ames?
Well, no, because they're discussing manufacturing,
Yeah.
not the shipment or the.
Yeah. Holmes says, look, this is the same result as Champion v. Ames. That if there's something bad going on in the states, Congress prohibit it before it gets to interstate commerce. They can ban it in advance. The Hammer versus Dagenhart opinion, again, is no longer good law. It was overturned during the New Deal in a case called Darby. We'll do Darby, I think, in about next class, I think. So we have these cases during the Progressive era. You have E.C. Knight, you have Champion and Hammer, and then Schechter Fulcher will do that one next class. But those were all cases that still tried to draw a line between what was local and what was national. In our next class, once we get to the New Deal, that line's out the window. That at that point, there's no longer any distinction between what is local and what is national. I want you just to take this tour with me through time, right? The justices can't agree on what John Marshall actually meant. He speaks of this letter and spirit of the Constitution, its convenience, and whoever's applying it can reach very different results. And this is one of the problems with these open-ended John Marshall opinions, where they drive me crazy. They're not only hard to teach, they're hard to apply. Because you can say, look, all these cases are consistent with McCulloch, or consistent with McCulloch, but they reach very different results. Okay, any questions on the Hammer versus Dagenhart, the child labor case? No? Okay, the video for the Schechter Poultry isn't working correctly, so the link probably won't work. So just don't worry about it, okay? I'm sorry? Oh, that's my animator, so it's at columns going up. It's to animate the columns going. It shifts from left to right.
Oh, okay.
So like it'll be like whoop. Like
okay.
This is for my animator. It's not so much for your benefit. The arrows don't mean anything.
Disregard arrows.
It's really hard to explain this to
Got
animators,
it.
so they have to explain ConLaw to them. It's actually a lot of fun. Any other questions? All right, have a good night, guys. I'll see you on Wednesday. Yeah, come on up.
It's not mine. I'll throw it in here, see what happens. Thank you, though.